The massive doors of the Galactic Council chambers slid open with a deep rumble that could be felt through the floor. Ambassador Kate Morrison stepped through the entrance, her black shoes clicking against the polished metal surface. Behind her, the security checkpoint buzzed and hummed with activity as delegates from across the galaxy prepared for the monthly assembly. Kate paused and turned to watch the familiar ritual unfold. To her left, a towering Vorthok representative hissed in, annoyance as the security scanner detected the venom sacs hidden beneath his thick, scaled skin. The machine's mechanical arms extended and carefully sealed each poison gland with a temporary biolock. The Vorthok's yellow eyes glowed with frustration, but he submitted to the process without complaint. Everyone knew the rules. A few meters away, 3 crystalline Zalani delegates stood perfectly still, while technicians fitted protective sheaths over their naturally sharp edges. Their bodies were living weapons, each facet and angle honed by millions of years of evolution to cut through bone and metal with ease. The sheaths dulled their deadly beauty, turning them from walking blades into harmless, if still impressive, sculptures. Kate watched a group of Korvan warriors reluctantly hand over their ceremonial claws. Each claw was the size of a human forearm, curved and razor-sharp. The Korvans growled low in their throats as the weapons were tagged and stored in secure lockers. Their muscular forms seemed somehow smaller, without their traditional arms. Like lions with their teeth pulled, the Nexari delegation sparked and crackled as bioelectric inhibitors were attached to their nerve clusters. Blue arcs of electricity danced across their skin before being dampened by the devices. One Nexari twitched as the last of his natural lightning was contained, his bioluminescent patterns dimming to a safe glow. Even the peaceful-looking Thraxi had to submit to having their acid-producing glands neutralized. Their soft, almost childlike faces belied the corrosive chemicals their bodies could produce. Kate had once seen a Thraxi accidentally melt through a titanium desk during a particularly heated debate about trade routes. Every species had something: claws, fangs, poison, electricity, acid, psychic abilities, or natural weapons that could kill or maim. Every species except one. Kate Morrison walked straight through the checkpoint without stopping. The scanners detected nothing. No weapons to confiscate. No natural defenses to neutralize. No biological threats to contain. She carried only a simple leather briefcase and wore a standard diplomatic uniform: blue jacket, white shirt, black pants. Nothing special. It's nothing dangerous. Or so it appeared. Behind her, a cluster of junior delegates from newly admitted species whispered among themselves. Their translators caught fragments of the conversation. Words like oversight and favoritism and special treatment drifted through the air. Kate pretended not to notice, but her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. The main chamber was a marvel of engineering and diplomacy. Hundreds of seats arranged in concentric circles around a central speaking platform. Each section was designed to accommodate the unique needs of different species. Atmospheric barriers maintained perfect environmental conditions for beings who breathed methane, sulfur, or pure energy. Gravity fields adjusted to support creatures who weighed 50 tons or could float like mist. Kate took her seat in the human section, a modest area with standard Earth normal conditions. The human delegation was small compared to others. 12 representatives for a species that controlled 47 star systems. Most other species brought armies of advisors, bodyguards, and assistants. Humans brought lawyers, economists, and social scientists. The chamber filled quickly. As the session time approached, Kate nodded politely to the other ambassadors as they found their places. The massive Garati delegates lumbered to their reinforced seats, each step shaking the floor. The ethereal whisper folk drifted to their elevated platform like living clouds. The insectoid hive queens settled into their specialized pods with their drones, arranged in perfect formation around them. A young Thraxi counselor named Zektar approached the human section. His pale blue skin gleamed under the chamber lights and his large dark eyes fixed on Kate with obvious confusion. Zektar was new to the council, representing a species that had only joined 3 months ago. His people were known for their logical minds and direct communication style. "Ambassador Morrison," Zektar said, his voice carrying the slight lisp common to his species. "I must inquire about an apparent irregularity in security protocols." Kate set down her briefcase and turned to face him. "Of course, Counselor." "Seems to be the problem?" "I observed your passage through the security checkpoint," Zektar continued. "No weapons were detected or confiscated. No biological defenses were neutralized. This appears to contradict established safety procedures. My people have studied the Council regulations extensively, and we find no mention of exemptions for human delegates." Several nearby delegates turned to listen. This was clearly not the first time the question had been raised. Kate could see the curious faces of species representatives she had worked with for years. Even they sometimes seemed puzzled by the arrangement. "You're absolutely right," Kate replied, her tone friendly and conversational. "Humans do receive different treatment at security checkpoints. We're the only species permitted to enter the chambers without surrendering anything." Zektar's expression grew more confused. "But why? Your species appears to lack any natural weapons or defenses. Logic suggests you would be among the least dangerous delegates present. Why then do you alone bypass standard protocols?" Kate glanced around the chamber as more delegates took notice of the conversation. She could see the calculation in their eyes. Some species viewed humans as weak allies, to be protected. Others saw them as clever but ultimately harmless negotiators. Few considered them useful tools for complex diplomatic situations. None of them understood the real reason for the special treatment. "The answer to your question," Kate said, settling back in her chair as the session bells began to chime, "will become perfectly clear during today's proceedings. I suggest you pay close attention to how we humans conduct our business here." The great chamber fell silent as Elder Thane called the session to order. Kate Morrison folded her hands in her lap and waited. Today's agenda included several contentious issues that would likely test diplomatic relationships. Perfect opportunities to demonstrate why humans were considered so dangerous that additional weapons would be redundant. The show was about to begin. Elder Thane's voice echoed through the chamber as the ancient ethereal called the session to order. His translucent form shimmered behind the central podium, centuries of wisdom evident in every movement. The gathered delegates settled into their seats, the soft murmur of dozens of languages fading to silence. "The first matter before the Council today concerns territorial disputes in the Outer Rim sectors," Thane announced. "Specifically, accusations of piracy and the harboring of criminal elements." A ripple of tension passed through the chamber. Everyone knew what this meant. The Corvan Empire had been building toward this confrontation for months. Their military expansion into neutral space had created friction with several peaceful species. But they seemed particularly focused on the Minari Collective. General Vexhai rose from his seat in the Corvan section. He was a perfect example of his species, nearly 3 meters tall, covered in thick gray hide that could stop most projectiles. His arms were thick as tree trunks, ending in hands that could crush steel. 4 rows of sharp teeth filled his massive jaw. Even with his ceremonial claws sealed away, he looked like he could tear apart most of the other delegates with his bare hands. "Honored Council," Vexhai began, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to shake the air itself. "The Corvan Empire brings serious charges against the Minari Collective. For 6 months, pirates have attacked our supply convoys in the Outer Rim. These attacks always occur near Minari space. When our patrols pursue the criminals, they vanish into Minari territory." The Minari delegates sat quietly in their section. They were small, barely half the size of an average human. Their pale green skin seemed to glow softly under the chamber. Lights, large, gentle eyes dominated their delicate faces. They looked like children sitting at the adult table. Ambassador Kellanara spoke for the Minari. Her voice was soft and melodic, barely audible even with the chamber's amplification systems. "The Corvan accusations are false. My people do not harbor pirates. We are a peaceful species. We have no military fleet, no weapons facilities. We grow food and study the stars. Nothing more." Vexhai slammed his fist on his desk. The sound rang through the chamber like a gunshot. Several smaller species flinched at the noise. Lies. Your people hide behind your reputation for peace, while criminals use your space as a safe haven. You profit from their crimes while pretending innocence. That is not true, Kellanara replied, her voice steady despite the obvious intimidation. We have opened our space to Corvin inspectors 3 times. They found nothing because there is nothing to find. Your inspections were limited. Vexi growled. Surface scans only. You refused deep space searches. You refused access to your orbital stations. You hide your guilt behind council regulations about sovereign space. The tension in the chamber grew thicker. Other delegates began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The Corvins had a point about the limited inspections, but their aggressive approach was making everyone nervous. This was exactly the kind of situation that could escalate into real conflict. Kate Morrison watched the exchange with professional interest. She had read the intelligence reports on both species. The Corvins were telling the truth about the pirate attacks, but they were wrong about the source. The pirates were actually a splinter group of exiled Vorthok criminals, but they were using stolen Minari identification codes to mask their ships. The Minari genuinely had no idea what was happening. In their outer territories, Ambassador Jake Collins, the senior human representative, stood up. Perhaps I could offer some perspective on this matter, said in a calm, measured tone. Vexi turned his massive head toward the human section. His yellow eyes narrowed as he studied Jake. The human was tall for his species, but still looked tiny compared to the Corvin general. Jake had gray hair and wore simple reading glasses. He looked more like a university professor than a diplomat. The humans wished to speak. Vexi's voice carried clear disdain. What could your weak species possibly contribute to this discussion? You have no military might, no natural weapons, no way to enforce justice against pirates. Several delegates around the chamber made sounds of agreement. The Thraxi counselor Zektar leaned forward in his seat, clearly interested to see how the humans would respond to such an obvious challenge. Jake smiled politely. You're absolutely right, General. Humans are quite weak compared to most species. Here, we can't tear apart steel with our bare hands. We don't have poison or lightning or acid. We're really quite fragile. Vexi seemed satisfied with this admission. Then you understand why military species like the Corvins must handle security matters. Peace-loving creatures like the Minari and humans should leave such dangerous work to those equipped for it. Oh, I completely agree, Jake said, nodding earnestly. In fact, I think the Corvins are perfectly suited for this type of problem. Your species has such impressive physical capabilities. Kate hid a smile. She recognized the tone Jake was using. It was the same one he had used during the trade negotiations with the Centauri Banking Consortium. The Centaurians still refused to take meetings with human representatives. However, Jake continued. I'm curious about one small detail in your investigation. You mentioned that the pirate ships vanish into Minari space when pursued. How exactly does that work? Vexi's expression grew confused. They use faster-than-light drives to escape. Obviously. Right, of course. But your patrol ships also have faster-than-light drives, don't they? Corvin military technology is supposed to be quite advanced. It is the best in the galaxy, Vexa replied proudly. Then why can't you catch ships using inferior technology? The Minari don't manufacture military vessels. Their fastest ships are farming transports. Surely the mighty Corvin fleet could outrun a bunch of farmers, a murmur passed through the Corvin delegation. Vexi's jaw tightened. The pirates have modified their ships, added military-grade engines. Ah, I see. So these pirates have access to military-grade faster-than-light drives. That's interesting. Where would simple criminals get such expensive equipment? Vexi was beginning to look uncomfortable. They steal it, obviously, from whom? The Minari don't have military shipyards. In fact, according to your own intelligence reports, the only species in that sector with advanced military technology would be... Jake let the sentence hang in. The air? Every delegate in the chamber could complete the thought. The only species with advanced military technology in the Outer Rim was the Corvin Empire itself. Are you suggesting, Vexi's voice was getting louder, that Corvin equipment is being used against Corvin ships? I'm not suggesting anything, Jake replied with that same polite smile. I'm just asking questions. Simple questions that I'm sure have simple answers. But Vex High was no longer looking confident. His fellow Corvins were shifting in their seats, whispering among themselves. The implications of Jake's questions were clear to everyone in the chamber. If the pirates had Corvin military technology, either the Corvin military was selling weapons to criminals, or Corvin security was so poor that criminals could steal their most advanced equipment. Either explanation made the Corvin Empire look incompetent or corrupt. You dare question Corvin honor? Vex High roared, rising to his full height. His massive form towered over the human section. You weak, clawless mammals have no right to challenge a warrior species. The chamber fell silent. Direct insults between species were a serious breach of protocol. But more than that, Vex High had just made a threat. His posture, his tone, his words, all suggested potential violence. Jay Collins remained perfectly calm. He adjusted his glasses and smiled. General, I think there might be some confusion here. I haven't challenged anyone. I've simply asked a few questions about your investigation. Surely a species as honorable as the Corvins wouldn't object to clarifying the facts. Vex High's hands clenched into fists. If you question our honor, then prove your worth. Face me. In combat, human, show the council whether your words have meaning, or if you are just another coward hiding behind clever speech. A collective gasp rose from the assembled delegates. A formal challenge of combat was rare in the modern council. Most species had moved beyond such primitive methods of settling disputes. Elder Thane's voice cut through the tension. General Vex High, you are out of order. This is a diplomatic assembly, not an arena. But Jake Collins held up a hand. It's all right, Elder Thane. The general raises an interesting point about proving worth through action. Kate Morrison felt her pulse quicken. She knew that look in Jake's eyes. She had seen it before, during the incident with the Tau Ceti Trade Federation. The aftermath of that negotiation was still classified. The human was about to do something that would change everything. Elder Thane's form brightened with sudden authority. His translucent body pulsed with energy as he commanded attention from every delegate in the chamber. The ancient ethereal had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. He had seen wars that consumed entire star systems and peace treaties that lasted for centuries. But most importantly, he had been present when humanity first joined the Galactic Council. General Vex High, you will sit down immediately. Thane's voice carried the weight of absolute command. And you, Ambassador Collins, will remain in your seat. No combat challenges will be issued or accepted in this chamber. Vex High's massive form trembled with barely controlled rage. But even the proud Corvin general did not dare defy the elder directly. He slowly lowered himself back into his reinforced chair, his yellow eyes still fixed on the human delegation. Jay Collins simply nodded and adjusted his glasses. Of course, Elder Thane. I would never dream of disrupting council proceedings. Thane's gaze swept across the chamber, taking in the confused faces of newer delegates and the knowing looks of veteran representatives. The Thraxi counselor Zektar looked particularly puzzled, his large dark eyes darting between the humans and the other species. I can see that our newer members require education, Thane said, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher addressing students. The protocols regarding human delegates are not arbitrary. They exist for very specific reasons, learned through very painful experience. Kate Morrison settled back in her chair, knowing what was coming. She had heard this story before, but it never failed to send chills down her spine. The other veteran delegates also seemed to brace themselves. Some actually moved their chairs slightly further away from the human section. 50 years ago, Thane began, when humanity first petitioned to join the Galactic Council, they were treated exactly like every other species. They submitted to our security protocols. They surrendered their primitive kinetic weapons at the checkpoints. They entered these chambers under the same restrictions as all other delegates. The elder's form dimmed slightly as he recalled the memories. We thought we understood them. Their technology was crude by galactic standards. They had no natural weapons, no biological defenses, no psychic abilities. They seemed harmless, perhaps even pitifully weak. Zektar leaned forward in his seat. This was exactly what he and many others had been thinking. Humans did appear to be among the most vulnerable species in the galaxy. The first incident occurred during what should have been a routine trade negotiation, Thane continued. The Nexari Confederation was attempting to establish shipping rights through human space. The Nexari delegate, a being named Sekalon, decided to use traditional intimidation tactics to force better terms. Several Nexari representatives in the chamber shifted uncomfortably. Their species was known for using their natural bioelectric abilities to establish dominance in negotiations. It was considered normal business practice among their people. Sekalon began displaying his electrical discharge capabilities, Thane said. Blue lightning danced across his skin. The air itself crackled with energy, spoke of the power his people could bring to bear against anyone who opposed them. Standard Nexari negotiation technique. Kate remembered reading about this incident in her diplomatic training. It had become required study material for all human representatives. The human delegate was Ben Carter, Thane continued. A middle-aged man with gray hair and a quiet demeanor. He sat calmly while Sakan's electrical display grew more intense. He did not seem impressed or frightened. He simply watched. The chamber was completely silent now. Even the environmental systems seemed to have quieted to listen to the elder's words. When Sakalin finished his demonstration, Carter began to speak. He did not raise his voice. He did not make any threats. He simply asked questions. Innocent questions about Nexari culture and society. Thane paused, allowing the tension to build. Carter asked about the Nexari hierarchy system. How individuals established their rank within the Confederation. How decisions were made in their government. How their military was organized. The current Nexari delegates were growing visibly agitated. Their bioelectric patterns were fluctuating in ways that suggested extreme discomfort. Within an hour, Carter had identified the fundamental weakness in Nexari's social structure, Thane said, where species bases everything on electrical output. The strongest bioelectric field rules. But Carter realized that this system creates a critical vulnerability. One of the Nexari delegates made a sound that might have been a whimper. Carter began to describe in perfect detail how a coordinated attack on Nexari power stations could cripple their entire civilization, not through physical destruction, but through social collapse. Without artificial electrical systems to supplement their natural abilities, the Nexari hierarchy would crumble. Weaker individuals would suddenly find themselves on equal footing with their former superiors. Kate watched as the Nexari representatives huddled together, their electrical patterns synchronizing in a way that indicated shared fear. But Carter was not finished, Thane continued. He explained how this information could be shared with Nexari rebel groups, how their own people could be turned against their government. He described the psychological profiles of individual Nexari leaders and identified which ones would be most susceptible to manipulation. The elder's voice grew colder. For 3 hours, Carter systematically dismantled everything that Sakalin believed about his species' strength and security. He did not make a single threat, he simply explained, in calm, reasonable terms. How the Nexari Confederation could be destroyed from within using nothing but information and psychology. Several delegates around the chamber were now staring at the human section with obvious unease. Jake Collins sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, looking for all the world like a harmless academic. When Carter finished speaking, Sekalon was found curled in a corner of the negotiation room, Thane said. He was sparking uncontrollably, his bioelectric field fluctuating wildly. He kept repeating the same phrase over and over. The humans know. The humans know everything. Zektar's pale blue skin had gone even paler. What happened to Seklan? He required 6 months of intensive therapy before he could function in diplomatic settings again, Thane replied. Even then, he could never be in the same room as a human representative. The mere sight of a human would trigger panic attacks. The chamber was so quiet that Kate could hear her own heartbeat. She glanced around and saw expressions of growing horror on the faces of delegates who had never heard this story before. The council initially dismissed this as an isolated incident, Thane continued. Perhaps Seklon had been unusually weak-minded. Perhaps the humans had simply been lucky. We decided to continue treating them like any other species. The elder's form pulsed with what might have been regret. We were wrong. The second incident occurred 3 months later, during the mineral rights dispute. The Gorvani hegemony was attempting to intimidate the smaller Pelican worlds into surrendering their mining claims. Kate knew this story too. It was even worse than the first one. The Gorvani brought their most fearsome negotiator, Thane said, War Chief Gractor, a being who had never lost a negotiation, stood nearly 4 meters tall and could crush a starship hull with his bare hands. The Pelican delegates were terrified. Thane paused again, gathering his thoughts. The human representative was Lisa Parker. She was a small woman, barely half Gractor's height. When she requested permission to mediate the dispute, many delegates laughed. How could such a tiny, weaponless creature help against a Gorvani war chief? But Kate knew the answer. She had studied Parker's techniques in advanced diplomatic training. The woman was a psychological surgeon, capable of dissecting minds with the precision of a laser scalpel. What happened next, Thane said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, changed everything we thought we knew about the nature of warfare itself. The elder's form began to brighten again as he prepared to continue the tale. Round the chamber, delegates leaned forward despite their fear, desperate to understand the truth about the seemingly harmless humans in their midst. Vexai had gone completely silent, his earlier bravado forgotten. Even the mighty Corvin general was beginning to understand that he had challenged something far more dangerous than he had imagined. Kate Morrison smiled quietly to herself. The real lesson was just beginning. Elder Thane's translucent form dimmed as he recalled the darker memories. The chamber remained silent, every delegate hanging on his words. Even the environmental systems seemed to have reduced their humming to avoid interrupting the tale.
This
Mineral rights dispute of 2387, Thane began, his voice heavy with the weight of history. The Gorvani hegemony had identified rich deposits of rare metals in the Pelican worlds. They wanted those resources for their military expansion, but the Pelican people had legal claim to their own system. Kate Morrison knew the Gorvani well. They were one of the most physically intimidating species in the galaxy, looked like living tanks, with thick armor plating, instead of skin and muscles that could bend steel. Their society was built entirely around strength and dominance. They respected nothing else. War Chief Gractar arrived with a full diplomatic escort, Thane continued. 12 of the largest, most fearsome Gorvani warriors. They filled the negotiation room with their presence. The Pelican delegates were so terrified they could barely speak. Zektar leaned forward in his seat. The Pelican worlds are a peaceful species. They have no military. How could they possibly resist Gorvani demands? They could not, Thane replied simply, which is why they requested council mediation. Gorvani agreed, confident that no mediator would dare challenge their obvious superiority. The elder paused, his form flickering slightly. Lisa Parker volunteered to handle the mediation. She was 43 years old, barely 1.5 meters tall, and weighed perhaps 50 kilograms. Standing next to Gractar, she looked like a child. Kate had seen pictures of Lisa Parker in the diplomatic archives, a small woman with short brown hair and kind eyes. She looked more like someone who might teach children than someone who could break the mind of a seasoned warrior. The session began with Gractar's traditional intimidation display, Thane said. He roared. He pounded his massive fists on the table. He described in graphic detail what Gorvani warships could do to undefended worlds. The Pelican delegates were shaking with fear. Several delegates in the current chamber nodded. They had all seen similar displays from various species over the years. Physical intimidation was a common negotiation tactic among the more aggressive civilizations. Lisa Parker sat quietly through the entire performance. Thane continued. When Gractar finished, she thanked him for his presentation. She complimented the Gorvani on their impressive physical capabilities. She seemed genuinely impressed by their strength. Kate smiled slightly. She recognized the technique. Acknowledgement and validation, followed by careful redirection. It was basic human psychology, but most alien species had never encountered it before. Then Parker began asking questions, Thane said. Simple, innocent questions about Gorvani society. How their military was organized. How they selected their leaders. how they maintained discipline in their ranks. The current Gorvani delegates in the chamber shifted uncomfortably. Their species had learned to be wary of human questions after the incident Thane was describing. Graktar was proud to answer, Thane continued. He described the Gorvani hierarchy system: strength determined rank. The strongest lead, the weaker obeyed. It was simple and effective. It worked for thousands of years. Elder Thane's voice grew colder. Parker listened carefully to every word. She asked for clarification on specific points. She wanted to understand exactly how the Gorvani determined who was strongest, how they handled disputes between warriors of similar strength, how they dealt with aging leaders who were no longer the most powerful. Kate could see where this was going. The Gorvani system, like many alien societies, had logical foundations but also critical weaknesses. Parker had been looking for those weaknesses. After an hour of questions, Parker began her real work, Thane said. She started with a simple observation. She noted that Graktar, despite being the largest Gorvani in the room, was not actually the youngest. Several of his escorts appeared to be in their physical prime while he showed signs of advancing age. The chamber grew even quieter. Several delegates were beginning to understand the implications. Parker asked Graktar about this directly. Thane continued. In Gorvani society, did physical strength naturally decline with age? If so, how did older leaders maintain their authority over younger, stronger warriors? Graktar had apparently been confident in his answer. Now, the Gorvani had traditional methods for handling such situations. Combat trials, honor duels. All the strongest always prevailed in the end. Parker nodded thoughtfully, Thane said. Then she asked another question. When was the last time Graktar had participated in a formal strength trial? How did he know he was still the strongest warrior in his group? Kate could imagine the growing discomfort in that room. Parker was doing what humans did best. She was making someone question their most basic assumptions about themselves and their world. The questions continued for another hour, Thane said. Parker explored every aspect of Gorvani hierarchy. She asked about the specific tests they used to measure strength, whether those tests truly reflected combat ability, whether the current system might be promoting the wrong types of leaders. Elder Thane's form brightened slightly, as if he were gathering energy for the most difficult part of the story. Then Parker moved to her real target. She began discussing the younger Gorvani warriors in the room. Kate felt a chill run down her spine. She knew what was coming next. Parker asked Graktar to identify the youngest warrior in his escort. Thane continued. A being named Vorkal, who was barely past the age of majority. Parker asked about Vorkal's training, his combat record, his potential for advancement. The elder paused, allowing the tension to build. Then Parker asked the question that changed everything. She wondered aloud whether Vorkal, in his physical prime, might actually be stronger than his aging war chief. A collective intake of breath swept through the chamber. Even species that had never encountered Gorvani culture could understand the implications of such a suggestion. Graktar roared in anger, Thane said. He declared that his strength was unquestionable, that no young warrior could challenge his authority, that the very suggestion was an insult to his honor. Kate knew that Parker had been expecting exactly that reaction. Anger made people careless, made them vulnerable to manipulation. Parker apologized immediately, Thane continued. She explained that she had not meant to insult anyone. She was simply trying to understand Gorvani culture. But then she asked another question. If Graktar was so confident in his superiority, would he be willing to demonstrate it? The chamber was so quiet that Kate could hear the soft humming of the translation systems. Every delegate seemed to be holding their breath. Parker suggested a simple test, Thane said. Nothing formal or threatening, just a basic display of strength to help her understand Gorvani capabilities. Perhaps Graktar could show how his power compared to that of his youngest warrior. Elder Thane's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. What happened next was the most systematic psychological destruction any of us had ever witnessed. Kate closed her eyes, remembering the classified reports she had read about this incident. The aftermath had required council intervention and extensive therapy for multiple Gorvani warriors. Parker spent the next 2 hours orchestrating a contest between Graktar and Vorkal. Thane continued. She designed the challenges, she said. the rules. She acted as the judge. And with every test, she subtly manipulated the results to favor the younger warrior. The elder's form pulsed with remembered horror. She did not cheat, she did not lie. She simply chose tests that played Dvorkal's strengths and Graktar's weaknesses. She interpreted results in ways that highlighted the war chief's declining abilities. She asked questions that made everyone present doubt what they were seeing. Kate opened her eyes and looked around the chamber. The faces of the other delegates showed a mixture of fascination and terror. They were beginning to understand what humans were truly capable of. By the end of the session, Thane said Graktar was broken. His own warriors were looking at him with doubt. His authority had been completely undermined. The proud war chief who had entered the room was reduced to a confused, desperate old soldier begging for validation from his subordinates. The elder's voice carried the weight of absolute truth. Parker achieved in 2 hours what would have taken the Gorvani decades to accomplish through their traditional methods. She had completely restructured their hierarchy without firing a single shot or issuing a single threat. Zektar's voice was barely audible when he asked, "What became of Graktar?" "He was found in his quarters 3 days later," Thane replied, "sitting in a corner, rocking back and forth." He kept repeating the same phrase over and over. How did she know? How did she know? The chamber remained silent for several long moments. Finally, one of the current Gorvani delegates spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. The war chief never recovered. He spent his remaining years in a medical facility, unable to function in any leadership role. His clan fell into chaos. 3. Separate succession wars followed. Elder Thane nodded sadly. The council realized we had a serious problem. 2 incidents with similar results could not be coincidence. We needed to understand what we were dealing with. Elder Thane's form grew dimmer as he prepared to recount the most disturbing incident in council history. The chamber had fallen into complete silence. Even the usually restless younger delegates sat perfectly still, their attention fixed on the ancient ethereal. "The Zephyrian crisis," Thane began, his voice barely above a whisper. 6 months after the Gorvani incident, we decided that direct testing was necessary. The council needed to understand the full extent of human capabilities. Kate Morrison felt her stomach tighten. She had read the classified reports about this incident during her advanced diplomatic training. Even decades later, the details were horrifying. The Zephyrian Empire was the obvious choice for this experiment, Thane continued. They possessed the most advanced psychological defenses in the galaxy. Their minds were protected by both natural evolution and technological enhancement. Several delegates nodded. The Zephyrians were famous for their mental abilities. They could resist psychic attacks, detect lies instantly, and maintain perfect emotional control even under extreme stress. If any species could withstand human psychological warfare, it would be them. The Zephyrians were confident, Thane said. They viewed the previous incidents as evidence of weak-minded opponents, rather than human strength. They believed their superior intellect and psychic abilities would make them immune to whatever techniques the humans employed. Gathering his thoughts, he sent their finest representative, Mindrender Zolthan, the most feared negotiator in their empire. He had never lost a diplomatic encounter. His psychic abilities allowed him to read thoughts, project emotions, and even cause physical pain through mental assault. Kate knew about Zelthon from the historical records. The Zephyrian had been considered unstoppable. His reputation alone was often enough to make other species surrender before negotiations even began. The human representative was Chris Murphy, Thane continued. A quiet man in his 50s with graying hair and a gentle demeanor. He looked more like a teacher than a diplomat. The Zephyrians were amused by the apparent mismatch. Zektar leaned forward in his seat. But surely the Zephyrian psychic abilities gave him an overwhelming advantage. He could read the human's thoughts and emotions. Elder Thane's form flickered with what might have been bitter laughter. That is exactly what Zolthon believed. Is exactly what we all believed. We were catastrophically wrong. The chamber grew even quieter, if such a thing was possible. Kate could feel the tension building as every delegate waited to hear. What had happened in that closed session 50 years ago? The meeting was held in a secure chamber, Thane said. Sealed from outside interference, only Zolthan and Murphy were present. The session was recorded for analysis, but the recordings were later classified at the highest levels. Kate knew that those recordings still existed, locked away in the deepest archives of Council security. Only a handful of beings in the galaxy had ever been permitted to view them. The session began with Zolthan's standard demonstration of power, Thane continued. He projected waves of psychic energy that would have paralyzed most species with fear. He read Murphy's surface thoughts and announced them aloud to prove his mental superiority. The elder paused, his form brightening slightly. Murphy sat calmly through the entire display. He complimented Zolthan on his impressive abilities. He seemed genuinely fascinated by Zephyrian's psychic technology. Kate recognized the pattern. Acknowledgement, validation, and then the careful questions that would lead to psychological destruction. But this time had been different. This time, the human had faced an opponent who could literally read his mind. Then Murphy began asking his questions, Thane said. But these were not the simple inquiries we had seen before. These questions were designed specifically for a psychic opponent. Elder Thane's voice grew colder. Murphy asked Zolthan about the nature of psychic communication, how thoughts were transmitted and received, how the Zephyrian mind processed multiple streams of consciousness simultaneously. Kate felt a chill run down her spine. She was beginning to understand where this was going. Zolthan was proud to demonstrate his abilities, Thane continued. He showed Murphy how he could read thoughts from multiple sources at once, how he could separate his own consciousness from external mental influences, how his psychic defenses protected him from mental assault. The elder paused again, allowing the tension to build. Murphy listened carefully to every explanation. He asked for detailed clarifications about specific aspects of Zephyrian psychology. He wanted to understand exactly how their minds worked. Knew that Murphy had been preparing for something specific. The human had not been trying to understand Zephyrian abilities for academic purposes. He had been looking for weaknesses. After 2 hours of questions, Murphy began his real attack. Thane said, but this was unlike anything we had seen before. He did not try to intimidate or manipulate. Instead, he began telling stories. Several delegates looked confused. Stories seemed harmless compared to the psychological warfare they had heard about. In the previous incidents, Murphy told Zolthan stories about human experiences, Thane continued. Personal anecdotes about fear, loss, betrayal, and pain. Simple human stories that any child might hear. Kate understood now. Murphy had been using the Zephyrian's own psychic abilities against him. By sharing emotionally charged human memories, he was forcing Zolthan to experience them firsthand through his psychic connection. But Murphy was not sharing random memories, Thane said. Every story was carefully chosen. Every emotion was precisely calibrated. He was feeding Zolthan a steady stream of human psychological experiences that the Zephyrian mind was not equipped to handle. The elder's form began to pulse with distress. Humans, you see, experience emotions differently from other species. Your psychological patterns are unique in the galaxy. When Zolthan tried to read Murphy's mind, he was forced to experience human consciousness directly. Kate knew from her training that this was the key to understanding human psychological superiority. Human minds worked in ways that other species found difficult to comprehend or resist. The stories continued for hours, Thane said. Murphy shared experiences of human childhood trauma, adult betrayals, lost loves, broken dreams. Each story was more emotionally complex than the last. The chamber remained silent, but Kate could see the growing horror on the faces of the other delegates. They were beginning to understand what had happened to the mighty Mindrender. Zolthan began to show signs of distress after the first hour, Thane continued. His psychic abilities, which had always been his greatest strength, were now working. Against him, he could not stop reading Murphy's mind. He could not block out the human emotions that were flooding his consciousness. Elder Thane's voice dropped to barely audible levels. Murphy noticed Zolthan's discomfort and expressed concern. He asked if the Zephyrian was feeling well. He offered to stop the session if it was becoming too intense. Kate recognized the technique. False concern, combined with the suggestion that the opponent was weak. It was a classic human manipulation tactic, made devastating by the psychic connection. Zoltan refused to admit weakness, Thane said. His pride would not allow him to end the session. So Murphy continued his stories. But now they became more focused, more personal, and more designed to exploit the specific psychological vulnerabilities he had identified in the Zephyrian mind. The elder paused, his form flickering with remembered trauma. What happened next was recorded by the chamber's monitoring systems. For 4 hours, there were no sounds of physical struggle, no psychic energy discharges, just Murphy's calm, measured voice telling his stories. Kate knew what the recordings had captured. Key hours of systematic psychological torture, carried out through nothing more than shared human experiences. But gradually, Thane continued. Other sounds began to be heard, whimpering, sobbing, and eventually screaming. The chamber erupted in gasps and whispers. Several delegates looked physically ill at the implications. The screaming was not Murphy's, Thane said quietly. The human never raised his voice, never showed any sign of distress. He simply continued telling his stories while Zoltan, the most psychically powerful being in the Zephyrian Empire, slowly lost his mind. Elder Thane's form brightened with terrible clarity. When the session finally ended, Murphy calmly gathered his papers and left the chamber. He thanked Zoltan for his time and expressed hope that their discussion had been productive. Kate could imagine the scene. Murphy walking out calmly while behind him the most feared psychic in the galaxy lay broken and traumatized. Zoltan was found hours later, Thane said, curled in a corner of the chamber, completely catatonic. His psychic abilities were permanently damaged. His mind had been shattered by exposure to human psychological experiences that his species had never evolved to handle. The elder's voice carried the weight of absolute truth. The Mindrender spent the remaining years of his life in a specialized medical facility. He never spoke again. He never recovered. The mere mention of humans would send him into convulsions. Of terror, the chamber remained silent for several long moments. Finally, Zektar asked the question that everyone was thinking: how is such a thing possible? Elder Thane's form brightened with the harsh light of terrible knowledge. The chamber remained frozen in silence, as every delegate waited for the final revelation. Even the environmental systems seemed to have gone quiet, as if the station itself was holding its breath. After the Zephyrian incident, the Council launched the most comprehensive investigation in our history, Thane began. We needed to understand what had happened. We needed to know what humanity truly was. Kate Morrison sat perfectly still, knowing that this moment would change how every species in the chamber viewed her people. The truth about human psychology was about to be revealed to beings who had never encountered anything like it. We brought in experts from every field, Thane continued. You're psychologists, evolutionary biologists, military strategists, and social scientists. We studied human history, human culture, and human mental development. What we discovered was beyond our worst fears. The elder paused, his translucent form pulsing with the weight of memory. Every other species in the galaxy evolved physical weapons for survival. Claws, fangs, poison, natural armor, psychic abilities. Humanity evolved something far more dangerous. Zektar leaned forward, his pale blue skin now almost white with tension. What did they evolve? The ability to weaponize empathy itself, Thane replied. The words hit the chamber like a physical blow. Several delegates made sounds of confusion or disbelief. The concept was so alien to most species that they could barely comprehend it. Humans are the only species we have encountered that naturally understands the psychological patterns of other beings, Thane explained. Not through psychic abilities or technological enhancement, but through pure evolutionary development. Kate knew this was the core truth about her species. Humans had survived on Earth not because they were the strongest or fastest, but because they could understand and manipulate the behavior of other creatures, including other humans. Most species develop empathy as a social tool within their own kind, Thane continued. Humans developed it as a weapon against anything with a mind. They can instinctively identify fears, desires, insecurities, and motivations in beings they have never encountered before. The elder's voice grew colder. But understanding is only half of their ability. The other half is manipulation. Humans do not simply read psychological patterns. They actively reshape them. Elder Thane gestured toward the human section of the chamber. Every human in this room is capable of psychological warfare that would cripple most species. They do it naturally, instinctively, often without even realizing it. Kate felt dozens of eyes turning toward her and her fellow human delegates. She maintained her calm expression, but she could see the mixture of fascination and terror on the faces around her. The investigation revealed the true scope of human capabilities, Thane said. In their recorded history, humans have developed more methods of psychological manipulation than all other species combined. They call it by many names: negotiation, diplomacy, marketing, politics, therapy, education. The elder's form flickered with something that might have been dark amusement. What other species consider torture, humans consider normal social interaction. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The implications were staggering. Humans could casually employ psychological techniques that other species found devastating. What were the limits of their abilities? We tested our findings, Thane continued. We arranged controlled encounters between human diplomats and representatives from various species. The results were consistent. Within hours, the human would identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities that the other species did not even know they possessed. Kate remembered reading about these tests in her diplomatic training. It had been ended quickly when too many alien representatives required psychological treatment afterward. The Corvan military, famous for their unbreakable discipline, was reduced to chaos by a single human asking questions about their chain of command, Thane said. The Nexari Confederation's electrical hierarchy collapsed when a human explained how their own biology could be turned against them. The current Nexari and Corvan delegates in the chamber looked physically ill. Their species had learned to fear human questions more than any weapon. The pattern was always the same, Thane continued. The human would begin with innocent curiosity. Simple questions about culture, history, or social structure. Then they would identify the fundamental assumptions that held the other species society together. Elder Thane's voice dropped to a whisper. Then they would destroy those assumptions using nothing but words. Kate knew this was why human diplomatic training was so extensive. Her people needed to learn to control their natural abilities, not develop them. Every human was born with the capacity for psychological warfare that other species found incomprehensible. The Council faced an unprecedented dilemma, Thane said. How do you contain a species whose very thoughts are weapons? How do you disarm beings whose minds are more dangerous than any technology? The chamber remained silent as every delegate contemplated this impossible question. The answer was both simple and terrifying, Thane continued. You cannot, human. Psychological capabilities cannot be surrendered at a security checkpoint. They cannot be sealed or inhibited without destroying the human mind itself. Kate understood now why humans received such careful treatment from other species. It was not respect or friendship. It was the careful handling of something too dangerous to provoke. So the Council made a decision, Thane said. If humans could not be disarmed, they would be classified as permanently armed. The security protocols were changed to reflect this reality. Elder Thane's form pulsed with grim authority. Humans are not permitted to be unarmed in council chambers. They are acknowledged to be incapable of being unarmed. Their designation as weapon-free is not a privilege. It is a warning. Kate Morrison stood slowly, knowing that it was time for humanity to speak. The chamber watched her with a mixture of respect and barely controlled fear. Elder Thane has explained our history accurately, Kate said, her voice carrying the friendly but unmistakably predatory tone that had become humanity's trademark in galactic politics. My species appreciates the Council's wisdom in recognizing our nature. She looked around the chamber, making eye contact with delegates from dozens of species. We understand that our psychological capabilities make other beings uncomfortable. We do not use these abilities lightly or without purpose. Kate's smile was warm and reassuring, but every delegate in the chamber could sense the deadly intelligence. Behind it, however, we also want to make something perfectly clear. When the Council designated humans as permanently armed, they were not exaggerating. The chamber grew even quieter, if such a thing was possible. Our minds are our weapons. Kate continued. Our questions are our ammunition. Our empathy is our targeting system. These cannot be checked at the door because they are part of who we are. She gestured toward General Vex High, who had shrunk back in his seat during the revelations. General, you challenged us to prove our worth through combat. You wanted to know if our words had meaning. Kate's expression remained friendly, but her voice carried undertones that made several delegates visibly flinch. The answer is yes. Our words have meaning. Questions have power. Our conversations can reshape minds and break spirits. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the chamber. The difference between us and other species is not that we are unarmed. The difference is that we are so thoroughly armed that additional weapons would be redundant. General Vexai made a small sound in his throat and looked away. The mighty Corvin warrior who had been so eager for combat an hour ago now could not meet the gaze of a small human female. The Council's protocols exist for everyone's protection, Kate concluded. Not to keep you safe from us, but to remind us to be careful with you. After all, when your words can break minds and your questions can shatter souls, even friendly conversation becomes a form of warfare. Kate sat down, folding her hands in her lap. Round the chamber, delegates stared at the human section with new understanding. The beings they had dismissed as weak and harmless were revealed to be the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. Elder Thane's voice broke the silence. This concludes today's session. All delegates are dismissed as beings from across the galaxy. Filed out of the chamber, they gave the human section a wide berth. Conversations were conducted in hushed whispers. Eyes darted nervously toward the humans before quickly looking away. General Vex High was among the last to leave. As he passed the human section, he stopped and looked at Kate Morrison. Ambassador, he said quietly, I withdraw my challenge. With apologies? Kate smiled warmly. No offense taken, General. Perhaps we can discuss the Outer Rim piracy issue at a later date. I have some ideas about identifying the real culprits. Vexai nodded quickly and hurried away, his earlier bravado completely forgotten. Vecdar approached more cautiously. Ambassador Morrison, he said, his voice uncertain. I believe I understand now why humans receive special treatment. Do you? Kate asked pleasantly. You are not the exception to the weapons policy, Zekdar said slowly. You are the reason the weapons policy exists.